my side as well. Without further ado, I would ask Dr. van der Aalst, I would say, or good. Van der Aalst from Erasmus University in Rotterdam to give her first presentation. She will be summarizing the evidence on lung cancer screening. Please.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. My name is Carlijn van Aalst and I'm a senior research fellow at Erasmus MC, Department of Public Health, and also working for the Nelson trial. And today I will try to summarize the evidence for you for CT screening for lung cancer. I have some basic slides, and actually all of you, I think you are familiar, but nevertheless I want to start with some background. It was estimated that about 1.3 million people decrease from lung cancer each year, and that accounts for about 28% of all cancer deaths. The 5-year survival rate of clinically detected lung cancer is less than 60%, as you all know, and this is mainly caused by the advanced stage of lung cancer at time of diagnosis. But about 90% or even more of the lung cancers are caused or attributable to smoking. And this brings us by the fact that lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer death, but it's also most preventable cause of morbidity and mortality. Oh, then another one. Last 10-15 years, the interest in CT screening for lung cancer increased, and there are some major reasons for that. And one of them is that smoking cessation is most effective prevention method, but in theory. In practice, we see that the smoking prevalences are still too high, although all efforts. And thereby there are people who quit smoking, and what we also see is that lung cancer is more and more detected in former smokers. So there's a need for other preventive measures. Thereby there were some single-arm studies in the past that showed that CT screening can detect lung cancer in an earlier stage. In this figure, yes, I have a pointer. This represents the idea of screening, and on the top you can see a situation without screening, and the idea is of course that at one moment in time the onset of lung cancer will occur, and then you have the symptoms, the diagnosis, and start treatment, and the aim is of course to reduce the serious consequences at the end. But the idea of screening is that there is a window to detect the lung cancer at an earlier stage, and the idea is of course that an earlier stage may have better treatment options with the over aim to further reduce the serious consequences at the end, but maybe also to provide a longer life. But when we consider lung cancer screening, we know that there are potential benefits but also potential harms. So these should be balanced out. And the main potential benefits of screening for lung cancer are, for example, the mortality reduction, of course a reduction in advanced disease, but also life years gained. However, we also have to deal with potential harms, such as the false positives, overdiagnosis, overtreatment, but also the radiation exposure and of course costs, but also the impact on health-related quality of life, but also the impact on, for example, smoking behavior. Last year we performed a systematic review to come up with an update of the evidence and research in PubMed, Embase, Medline and Cochrane Library, and we searched for studies published. That's not. no, this is the end. That's not... Okay, this is the end, but I will go through this. This is more easier. It's faster. Yeah, okay, that's maybe more easy. We start with studies published from June 2011, because that was the time that the NLST results came online, so we think that was an important date. And we searched for all articles that were relevant to answer the question, what are the latest developments and unanswered questions? But then we found a lot of relevant articles, and we have also, we have restriction in our review, so we selected most relevant ones, and then we came up with about 70 articles, and we excluded, although these topics are definitely relevant, articles about biomarkers, genetics, and workup after diagnosis. In this table you can see all current randomized controlled trials, and they are listed from the largest one to the smallest one. And of course we have the NLST, you can see this, yeah. And then we have the Nelson trial, those are the two biggest ones. And then we have the smaller European trials. And what you can see here is the recruitment method and whether they are population-based or not. And the follow-up periods that the studies have published so far. And these range from about 3 years to almost 10 years. Most of the trials compared CT screening with usual care, but the NLST compared the CT screening with the chest X-ray. Here you can see the selection of the population, selection of the high-risk population, and what you can see all try to include the high risk based on the smoking history, and they are more or less comparable, but there are in all trials some differences. And most trials use annual screening, but the Nelson trial is the only trial with different screening intervals. I think all of you know this figure. It's the figure of the NLST team when they came up with the mortality reduction. And based on this, the US Preventive Services Task Force requested for an independent modeling study and an independent review before they came up with a recommendation. The modeling study was done by the CISNET lung group, and also Harry de Koning of the Nelson trial is part of this group. And the aim of this study was to identify most optimal scenarios for CT screening for lung cancer. And they evaluated almost 600 scenarios, and all these scenarios varied in, for example, starting age of screening, the stopping age of screening, but also the smoking history, and screening, the screening strategy in terms of the number of screening rounds, but also differences in screening intervals. So that makes it, there are almost 600 scenarios. And based on this modeling study, they came up with an optimal scenario in terms of harms and benefits. And they came up that, with the scenario that annual CT screening for those aged between 55 to 80 years, for people who smoked at least 30 pack years and who quit smoking for less than 15 years is most optimal. Then about 90% of the population will be eligible for screening. And this scenario means that about 300,000 screens are needed to prevent 500 lung cancer deaths. And this should result in lung cancer mortality reduction of about 14%. And it can also gain more than 5,000 life years per 100,000 persons. But it also means that about 190 lung cancer cases might be overdiagnosed. Here you can see a figure with the 9 most optimal scenarios, and the yellow one is the most optimal scenario. Then you can see here the green dot, and this dot represents the NLST criteria. And as you can see, it's not most optimal because it's not on a line. And as you compare those scenarios, you can see that increasing the stopping age of screening from 75 to 80 years, you came to the optimal scenario. Then there was done a systematic review for the USPSTF to come with the latest evidence. Here you can see in the table the mortality reduction analysis, and as you can see, there's only one trial with a significant mortality reduction, but it's also this NLST, so it's the biggest one. And what we see with the other European trials is that they fail to show a mortality reduction, but what we also see is that they are rated having a poor or moderate quality because of the small sample sizes and a short follow-up duration. In our review, we updated these figures, but you can see here the numbers, but in conclusion, there's nothing changed actually at this moment. I hope you can read it. In this table, we try to summarize for all trials the histology of the screen-detected lung cancer and also the stages of the screen-detected lung cancers. And what we see is that in all trials, and there is a variation, of course, relatively more adenocarcinomas were found. And also what's positive is that the majority of the screen-detected lung cancers were in stage 1. Then there were also some studies about the cost effectiveness of CT screening for lung cancer. And most of the trials were based on the NLST data, but there was also one modeling study from Canada, and the UK LS came up also with an analysis. And perhaps unexpectedly, almost all numbers are below the threshold of $100,000. But the big question is, what should be the threshold that the WHO recommended a threshold of about 3 times the GDP, but we know that this will vary across countries, and there is uncertainty about the acceptability of CT screening for lung cancer among the countries. So although CT screening for lung cancer has been implemented in the US. Then we have also the risk of screening, of course, and based on NLST data, it was found that attending the whole screening program, one participant can receive up to 25 CT scans in the whole period, and it was estimated that on average a participant received about 8 millisieverts in radiation dose per 3 years, and this would mean that there's about 1 radiation-induced cancer per 2,500 screened individuals in the next 10 to 20 years. But what's hopeful is that one is able to further reduce the radiation dose. So there are at this moment CT scanners that are able to reduce the dose to almost just X-ray. So that's very hopeful for the future. Then of course we have the false positives. We know that in about half of the screened individuals there will be found 1 or more lung nodules, and only few of them turned out to be malignant. So these positive screening results ask for further workup, and of course there's a risk for complications. There's also a negative effect on health-related quality of life, and it of course increased healthcare costs. And in this table you can see the positive screening test results and also the false positive screening test results. And we see a big difference between, for example, the NLST. When we look at all scans, about 23% of all scans are false positive. And when we look at the Nelson trial, it's only 1.2%. So there are big differences. And why are these differences there? In the Nelson trial, we use volume measurement instead of using a diameter. And we use a high threshold for test positives. But maybe more important, we have a third screening test result. We use an indeterminate test result. And these people receive a repeat scan after 6 weeks to 12 weeks to again measure the volume and growth. And based on that screening result, the final test result is negative or positive. And we also see in the lung rats recommendation that when we compare it with NLST criteria, that increasing the threshold reduced the false positives, but there's also a reduction in sensitivity. So it's difficult to say what's the optimal threshold. Then we have the issue about overdiagnosis. We defined it as a screen-detected lung cancer that would never have been clinically detected if screening not had occurred, because there are different definitions of that, but this is our definition. And there were some analyses, and the excess incident analysis of the NLST data show that there's about 18.5% overdiagnosis and microsimulation modeling of the NLST criteria versus the USPSTF recommendation, that there is about 8 to 10% overdiagnosis. And we found no impact of screening, no long-term impact of screening on health-related quality of life. So that's positive. Then when we consider lung cancer screening, we have to think about what's the optimal screening strategy. And one of the issues here is the screening population, because the importance of risk-based selection was shown in the fact that about 60% of the participants accounted for about 88% of the averted lung cancer deaths. And at this moment there are risk prediction models, and they are developing these to further be able to select the participants based on their risk. And that is very important, I think, for further screening programs. The screening interval has also a direct impact on the balance between the harms and benefits. And we see in previous analysis that those with a baseline negative screening test result, they have a lower risk for developing lung cancer compared to the other screened participants. And when we think about that baseline, that we skip the incidence screening for those with a baseline negative screening test result, the lung cancer mortality would increase from 186 of 68 lung cancer deaths per 100,000 person years to 212 lung cancer deaths per 100,000 person years. But this small increase will lead to a reduction in CT screenings for 70% of the participants. So that would mean that we can save a lot of screens. And again, it highlights the need for adequate risk stratification, so for the recruitment, but also for the screening intervals. Then the nodule management protocol is important in the screening policy. We see differences between the trials. Some trials use diameter, some trials use the volume and the growth. And we see that both methods have comparable sensitivity and negative predictive values. But what we see is that when you use volume and growth, that the higher specificity and positive predictive value you have with using volume and growth. And when we increase the cutoff points for the test positives, of course there will be less positives, and this means also less workup, but then you may miss some lung cancer. So we are not there. We have to further optimize the protocol. And again, we think that the use of a third screening test result might be a good solution here. And the use of risk prediction models are very useful in the nodule management protocols. Then we have also the impact of lung cancer screening on smoking cessation, because I think a very important message to participants is that screening is absolutely no alternative for smoking cessation. And so when we look at the trials, we also see that CT screening for lung cancer might be a teachable moment for smoking cessation. We see that because the quit rates among the screenees is higher when we compare that with the general population. And what we also see is when we combine the CT screening with a smoking cessation intervention, then the hazard ratio for lung cancer decreased among the former smokers. However, there is insufficient evidence about what's the best smoking cessation services in this high-risk population, because all these people are older adults having a long-term smoking history. About half of them are heavy smokers. Most of them try to quit smoking several times. So it's a complex population for smoking cessation. Then, when we think about implementation, we know that CT screening should only for high-risk groups, but the big question is how to scale up such a risk stratification-based prevention program. It requires well-defined, evidence-based and organized and protocolarized approach. And here you can see some points. Of course, there are more points, but we try to list some main points that should be included in such an approach. The risk selection and recruitment, of course, is difficult. We have to train all people in CT screening for lung cancer. There should be a defined nodule management protocol, but also we have to think about the workup of screen-detected lung cancer and also the treatment of these screen-detected lung cancer. So there are a lot of things to think about before you can implement such a program nationwide. And further, we need, of course, enough resources. And for the Netherlands, we used, for the Dutch colon cancer program, we used a decision modeling tool to investigate whether there is capacity, for example, to implement a nationwide screening program. And it was helpful for here. And furthermore, I think that I should go to this one. It's also very important because of the risk-based selection that we think about the informed decision-making process about screening for those who are eligible for screening, but also for the ineligibles. And that's also on the next slide. Because how to communicate individuals that they are not eligible for CT screening. For example, for breast cancer screening, all women in a certain age group were invited. But what's difficult here is that the question is, how good is the risk-based selection? So what to do then when a low-risk individual is clinically diagnosed with a lung cancer, but while being excluded from the program? But also what to do when a person is falsely reassured and presents with signs and symptoms. So there are a lot of questions that need to be addressed. And maybe the biggest question here, most important, is also how to reduce the referral and false positive rates without affecting the test performance of the program. In our review, we concluded actually that the population at risk will remain high for at least decades. So there are opportunities for screening, and we think that CT screening for lung cancer could help to reduce the burden of lung cancer, but the question is in what format. And there are articles about the benefits, harms and cost effectiveness, but almost all of these articles were based on the NLST data, so it's only one large randomized controlled trial. And we think that we further try to optimize the risk prediction models to know more about what person might have benefit from lung cancer screening. And what we also see is there's very limited evidence about how to scale up such a program. And we also need to monitor the unintended side effects, such as the impact on smoking cessation and so on. Because this is, in lung cancer screening, different from, for example, breast cancer screening. And we think that CT screening is likely to become an important element in addressing the burden of lung cancer, but the big question is how. Okay, thank you for your attention.